When we were last together, we learned about the structure of the moral act, object, end, and circumstance. Let's remember also our very first lesson, which perhaps was the most important, that Catholics do not begin moral theology by asking, what must I do and what must I refrain from doing? What will the punishments be for my actions? What might the rewards be? How guilty am I? Or how meritorious are my acts? No, Catholics begin with the question of who made you and why. The answer to that question, of course, is God made you, and God made you to know, love, and serve and enjoy Him forever in heaven, namely for beatitude. In order to get to one's final end, however, in order to attain beatitude, one is going to need some strengths because life is difficult and things get rocky and people are tempted often towards sin. We are indeed inclined to sin through concupiscence, a fancy theological word which means our will is now bent towards sin. The harmony that once existed between the intellect, the will, and the appetites is no longer present in fallen man ever since Adam and Eve. So for that reason, to come towards our final end and to have any hope of achieving beatitude at all, we would need certain strengths. Remember that virtue comes from the Latin word vir, which means man at its root. So etymologically, vir, strength, masculinity, a manly power is what we're calling on when we're seeking a virtue. And again, don't get offended. This is not sexist in any way. It's just men symbolize certain things in the ancient and medieval mind. One of them is strength and activity and energy. And so that's why virtue is a habit of strength towards the good. Right? So let's remind ourselves what virtues are, and then we're going to get right into the 7 virtues with St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas did not invent the 7 virtues, of course. He didn't even come up with the names. In fact, the 4 cardinal virtues can be traced back to Plato. However, St. Thomas Aquinas has an exactitude, a succinctness, an accuracy that is very much appreciated by theologians, and much of his language is used even in the Catholic Catechism today. So I think that you'll find his language particularly helpful. He's often thought of as this cold intellectual, but he's not that at all. He is a good marriage, I think, of both intellect and the beauty, the passion of desiring God and of loving the truth. So let's refresh ourselves really quickly on what virtues are and what they do for us. First of all, let me just pop the bubble right now in case you're hoping that a lesson in virtue can make you more virtuous. That's not true. Virtues are practical habits. That is to say, they are practiced things, not intellectually known things. So a person could have a great, exhaustive, encyclopedic knowledge of all virtues. He would be able to name the virtue of the day, the virtue of the moment. But that's not going to make that person any more virtuous. There's a reason for that. Virtues are habits. In fact, as St. Thomas Aquinas calls them, virtues have both a matter and a form. Thomas using Aristotelian language there. The matter of a virtue, the thing that it's made of, the stuff of a virtue is a habit. The stuff that it's made of. But the form, like the form that one would give to a clay sculpture, the thing that makes it to be what it is the good or perfection. Again, not perfection as in total flawlessness, but that a thing becomes perfected as it draws towards its final end. An acorn is perfected into an oak tree. A puppy is perfected into a dog. And a child is perfected into a full-grown adult. So as we look at these 2 parts of what a virtue actually is, the matter and the form, we can remember something about virtues. A virtue is a lot more like practicing your 3-point shot than it is about like memorizing the periodic table. Knowing virtues doesn't make you virtuous. At least not by itself. It can help us in the way of a roadmap. It can help us to see where we're supposed to go. But it's not the car. I was once in high school, I was once in gym class, and my generous, if not ill-intentioned gym teacher sort of said to me, you're going to hit a baseball today. You have unlimited strikes. You're going to stand here and swing the bat until you can hit the baseball. And boy, I think we might have stopped in our 50s. That is swing number 50 something was when we finally gave up. Because I had not practiced baseball ever in my life. It's not a sport that I was drawn to. And he kept saying things that were like sort of textbook or coaching lines like keep your eye on the ball, or choke up on the bat, or lower your elbow a little, raise your elbow a little, open your stance a little. And he kept telling me these things, and I was getting really frustrated because I was like, well, yeah, the problem is not that I don't intellectually know what I'm supposed to do. The problem is that I have not done this before. The problem is I'm terrible at baseball. You shouldn't be putting me through this torture. I've not practiced this over and over. So remember, as we speak of the virtues, that this video probably won't help anyone to become more virtuous. At least it can't practice the virtues for you. But what it can do is light the path. It can be a roadmap for us to see if we're trying to attain beatitude, that is to say, objective happiness. These are some of the signposts that we should look for along the way, some of the things that we should pack along with us, some of the strengths that can get us there to resist temptations and sufferings and hardships, and to help us to attain beatitude. And of course, let me just say, especially for all our Protestant friends who might be watching, when I say attain beatitude, I of course do not mean, as you'll see very quickly, by our own efforts alone. I do mean, of course, with the graced assistance of God himself, in cooperation with the grace of God. So, just so that you don't misunderstand me there. Well, let's get right into it, remembering that our end of beatitude is objective happiness. That is where we are going here. So, what strengths might a person have to obtain beatitude? What habits might a person develop to get to that final end? That is to say, union with God himself. What things might you pick up along the way? Well, it's important to note first that these do need to be habits. Imagine that I gave you a new sports car, and instead of telling you how to drive it and teaching you moment by moment, letting you drive it, let's say day by day, getting you accustomed to the car, I gave you an enormous manual. And that manual had all the things you're supposed to do and all the things that you're not supposed to do, all in one gigantic book. Not only would it be ridiculous and boring and offensive to you, you probably actually wouldn't learn to drive that beautiful car with such a manual because it's legalistic and it's not practical. So these things need to be habits, because in the moment, life is rough and life is quick and things happen immediately. So in the moment, you're probably not going to be able to deliberate and run and go get your catechism if you're tempted to an excess of anger or something, or if you need to be courageous in a certain moment. You're not going to be able to run and grab your Bible and thumb through it and find the correct passage to see how courageous you need to be. So they need to be habitual. They need to flow from you, from the inner person that you are. They can't just be an attachment or something that you sort of like can reach out to in an academic manual or something like that. So that's why they need to be habits. The first time we do a virtue, the first time we do a good action, rather, it's going to be a little bit more difficult than the 10th time. But they get easier and easier, so that by the 1000th time that you've told the truth in a difficult situation, you are already a truth teller. That habit is part of you. It's part of your character. You are a person who tells the truth, so it won't be agonizing to do. On the other hand, if you aren't a truth teller, if you aren't, let's say, a person of integrity, a faithful person, whatever the quality might be, if you've developed a vice instead of a virtue, a vice would be a habit towards the bad, then it'll be incredibly hard to suddenly become a good person in a dire moment. For an enormous challenge, like faced with the threat of death or faced with an incredible temptation, something that you've always wanted, it'll be incredibly hard if you've not developed that virtue to do the right thing in that moment. So it's not as if we're isolated creatures in every moment, sort of able in perfect freedom to decide between this or that action. No, we're creatures of habit, and we move either towards or further away from beatitude with every action that we take. Let's get right into the queen of the virtues, the charioteer of the virtues, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. The first virtue we'll talk about today is prudence. Prudence is recto ratio agibilium in Latin. That is to say, right reason in action. Right reason in action. Prudence is the first of what we call the cardinal virtues, from the Latin word cardines, for a hinge, like the hinge on a door. All of these virtues have for their object right reason. This is important to emphasize in the context of prudence immediately. Right reason is not my reasoning. Right reason is not my opinion. Right reason is not even the church's opinion. Right reason is an objective reality out there in the universe. It's the code behind the matrix. It's God's eternal law, to use the words of St. Thomas Aquinas himself. When we speak of right reason, we speak of just the way things work, the way that the universe was constructed, the order behind things, such that, for example, adulterers and faithless people often encounter great difficulty. I would say actually always encounter great difficulty because of those decisions. That's not an opinion. No jury or judge has to convict them of that here on earth. It's simply a natural consequence of the way that they have acted, being unfaithful. So right reason here is the object of all the cardinal virtues. There are 4 cardinal virtues, and they are not totally dependent on faith. That is to say, an atheist can be exceedingly virtuous in these first 4 ways. So they are pointed towards, they are aimed at reasonableness in action. And again, I can't emphasize enough, that reasonableness is not just how I feel the action should be or how you feel the action should be. It is actual reasonableness itself. It's reason in the world. And we'll give you several examples along the way to illustrate that. So, right reason in action is sometimes called the charioteer of the virtues, Prudence. Prudence, in some contexts, has gotten this bad name of being like a kind of a wormy, kind of like timid intellectual act where you sort of take the more conservative or the more shrewd route. And that's not at all what prudence means. Prudence simply means taking the things we know from the principles that we have come to believe in life. For example, that being an honest person is good, and bringing them to bear in this situation here and now. It is the habit of doing that with wisdom. So, for example, I might believe in an abstract, general way that honesty is good, and that honest people often come out the better over dishonest people, let's say. But in a certain situation, someone asks me a difficult question, and I have to decide right then, am I going to be fully honest with them? How much am I going to disclose? Is there discretion involved? I can't sit there and run through all these questions explicitly in my mind every time. This is why virtues need to be a habit. If I have become, though, a person who practices wisdom, that is to say, who habitually moves towards right reason in the things that I do, then prudence is a part of me. And the more prudent I get, the more aimed at truth and reason and rationality and logic and goodness that I actually am. So prudence is called the charioteer or the driver of the virtues because you can have all the abstract theological knowledge that you want. You can have all the instincts of justice and mercy and self-control that you want. But if you can't bring them to bear in this situation here and now, then they're not worth very much. So prudence directs the other virtues toward the proper object, which is reasonableness, right reason in this scenario. So that's prudence. Let's move on to the second one. Justice. Justice itself, that is to say, justice as it exists out there in the universe, is what ought to be done. But the virtue of justice, the part of justice that I can reflect in myself, is rendering to each what is due. Rendering to each what is due. That, of course, is a habit of the soul, and it has many related virtues, as St. Thomas calls them, potential parts. So depending on the specificity of their object. So for example, rendering to parents what is due is filial justice, right? The justice of a son. Rendering to God what is due is piety. So gratitude is an aspect of justice, is a sub-virtue of justice, you might say. So that if I sit down to a meal that someone has cooked for me with great effort and gone to great expense, perhaps, to prepare, and I am grateful for it, it's not just nice, it's not just polite for me to do, it's a matter of justice because they are due my gratitude. It is right and just that I give them my gratitude for that meal, that I be grateful for that meal. Let me stop here just for a moment and consider what I'm saying, because I can almost hear a critic in the background who might say, well, but these things, such as right reason and justice, they're entirely subjective. How can you even speak of these things as if there's something out there in the universe? Are we supposed to just listen to you? Even if it's St. Thomas, are we supposed to just take St. Thomas's word for it? I mean, for goodness sake, what one person thinks is due is so often so different to what another person might think is due. In fact, if you take a Christian and a Buddhist and a Muslim and a Jew and whoever, an atheist, and you put them all in a room, for goodness sake, even if you take 10 Christians and put them all in a room, put them on one jury and ask them what you think a criminal deserves for his crime, and it's guaranteed that you will come up with completely different answers from each person. In other words, does the variety of opinions about justice mean that there is no objective justice? Does that mean that this virtue itself is worthless? Well, let me respond to that in two ways. The first way is this. Even if we can't perfectly get to something, even if we can't perfectly articulate an idea or execute something in reality, we don't throw everything out that has to do with that idea. For example, if in mathematics or the sciences, if we're working something out, if we're trying to work out some theory and we get a piece of evidence that doesn't fit with it, or if we're competing with another scientist or mathematician, let's say, who has a different theory about how things work, we don't immediately look at the host of opinions about it and say, wait a minute, there are 3 opinions on that? Wait, 50 opinions? No, not at all. We don't take that and throw the entire enterprise out the window and say, well, forget about it, it doesn't exist then. I'll give you just one example. Did you know that in biological science, there are 21 definitions of the term species right now in 2025? Now, there are only about 7 that get used an awful lot, but 21 have been accepted. Peer-reviewed journals have published work using these definitions of the simple term species. That is to say, the lowest kind of a thing. And that none of them are completely cooperative. None of them overlap completely with one another. There's phylogenetic definitions, there's genetic barcoding, and of course there's the textbook definition, which is if the 2 things can mate and produce a fertile offspring, that's a species. If not, it's not a species. It turns out that that's not true. No one thing perfectly fits in. And so, but it's not like you read about that and you go, oh, forget it then. There's no such thing as biology then. There may be no such thing as species. Maybe there's no such thing as any animals. Maybe science itself would just throw it all out the window. We don't act like that. We simply say, wow, we need to keep looking into this. We need to keep trying more and more. If a person came into a courtroom and let's say there were a panel of judges, say it's a really serious case, say something like the Nuremberg trials or something, and so there are multiple judges, let's say, and they're conferring about what ought to be done. Imagine if one of the judges got up, say there are 3. Imagine if one of the judges got up and she just went, you know what? I can't believe you guys have a different opinion about what ought to happen to this criminal than I do. There must be no such thing as justice. Forget it. I quit. It's an absolute overreaction. Just because we can't perfectly instantiate something doesn't mean that we have to get rid of the entire concept altogether. We imperfectly instantiate things that we believe to be perfect all the time. And that leads me to my second response to that, because this is really important. If you don't think that reasonableness or justice, again, which is an aspect of right reason, if you don't think that that objectively exists, then you are denying something that is common to every single person that has ever lived. We have all wanted to believe that there is some objective, perfect justice. It's not just that we've wanted to believe it, actually, we've had to believe it. It animates everything that we do. A man works and provides for his family because it's the right thing to do, and it would be wrong to abandon them. Now, he may endure some kind of temporal punishment for failing to do that too, and that certainly is a motivator. But deep down at the heart, isn't there something within all of us that calls for perfect justice? When we see something that is egregiously wicked, or something that is incredibly good, don't we want to either punish or reward that thing accordingly? And it's not just because we feel like it, it's just not just because our feelings happen to be inclined towards rewarding this man who selflessly worked for the poor his entire life. It's not just because it makes us feel good to give him honor or to revere him or to want to copy him. It's because he did something that's legitimately good and inspiring. And it is right and just that we respond to that with praise, with honor, right? I was just reading recently about a certain person who, for free, ever since the hurricane in North Carolina, has been, since the floods rather, in North Carolina, has been rebuilding houses for the last 3 years. And he has just done this absolutely for free. He's not accepted a penny. Now, if justice weren't a real thing, if reason weren't built into the world, I would have to say something like, oh, well, that happens to please me to hear about that. What am I, a robot? It doesn't just happen to please me to hear about that. That's wonderful. That's a good man. I want to give him honor for that. I want to do things like he's doing. We couldn't do that if justice weren't real. Now, I suggest it's actually impossible to live as if justice and reason don't exist in objective reality, not just according to opinion. Now, see, you can have different opinions about what is right. You can have different opinions about what is reasonable. But you cannot set up the opinion that there is nothing right and nothing reasonable and live that out. It denies a part of us that is too core to who we are. Anyhow, that is a worthy aside, because the number one attack on these two concepts right here is subjectivism, moral relativism. It's that just because there are many, many opinions about something, or just because we can't embody it perfectly, or perhaps just because we don't like it, that justice is not real, that reason itself is not real. Well, you might be able to write that on a paper. You might be able to make a TikTok stating that. You might be able to shout about it on the internet, but I bet you can't live like that. And by the way, the people who believe those sorts of things, that there is nothing objectively reasonable or objectively just or unjust, it's all just, socio-cultural conditioning or whatever it is, those same people, I guarantee you, if you start asking them controversial things, or if you start saying offensive things around them, it will take about 10 seconds for that entire worldview to melt away. And you will see that at the core, if you say something super offensive, if you say something, let's say political, you will see that that monster will come back out, the aggression will come back out, but it's based on a deep conviction that something is really right or wrong. Not just that it makes them feel a certain way, but in reality, that something is really unreasonable or reasonable, not just because they happen to think that way, but in reality. So that is prudence and justice. Let's move right along because we are with time here. So temperance is the third cardinal virtue. Temperance is the moderation of sensual pleasure. The moderation of sensual pleasures. Again, according to right reason. Temperance is not the suppression of our desires, as people like Freud would have us believe, that whenever we say no to ourselves, we're suppressing something. No. Temperance is the habit of putting order to what I want at any given moment. See, what I want at any given moment is pretty disordered, naturally. If I acted like an animal, if I just followed my base desires to their maximum extent, I wouldn't just eat one piece of chocolate cake after a meal, I would eat 5 pieces, because chocolate tastes good. I wouldn't just take one woman for my wife, I would try to take whoever I felt like at any given moment, if I put no order to my passions. I would become as angry with someone as I wanted to, because it feels good. I would do whatever I wanted, and that would be profoundly unfree. It would be profoundly disordered. I'd be living like a subhuman. So temperance is the habit of placing order onto my desires and bringing them into moderation. According to what? Right reason. So, for example, in food and drink, especially in alcohol, temperance is easily visible as a virtue. I cannot draw closer to my final end if food and drink take up an inordinate, that is to say, an unreasonable or disordered amount of space in my life. This is really easy to see in our recreation as well. We can all see moments where we've had something that is probably good in and of itself, but takes up a disordered amount of space in someone's life. That is to say, they think about it too often. They spend too much time on it. It becomes too elevated for them. So some sensual pleasure, something that they do to please themselves. Sensual, by the way, doesn't mean anything like sexual. It means of the senses. So temperance here, according to Aquinas, applies to those things that please our appetites. Right? So the moderation of those things is not just an act that we do to grind our teeth and say, okay, I guess I'll put my lust away for now. It's supposed to be a habit wherein we realize that things like lust and wrath and gluttony make us profoundly unfree. In fact, they make us less of who we are. So far from Freud's ideas about suppression in psychoanalysis, where if you suppress something, if you repress something, it will come back with mighty force and manifest in all of these psychopathologies. The truth of it, of course, is actually the total opposite. You are never more yourself than when you are under control, than when you're conforming to right reason. You're never more yourself than when your life and your appetites, your intellect, your will, and your appetites are ordered, where they are reasonable. You can have food, but not any food, and not in any amount, and not whenever you want. You can have sex, but not anyone, whenever you want. Right? It shouldn't displace other things in your life. And remember, again, the final end of all these is Beatitude. So while their immediate object is right reason, never forget the one who created right reason, the one who is reasonableness itself. So let's go on to the last one, which is Fortitude, the last of the Cardinal Virtues. I love the way that St. Thomas treats Fortitude, by the way. He calls it a strength of soul in the fear of danger or death. Strength of soul is fortitude. Now, if prudence is the charioteer of the virtues, fortitude are the wheels of the chariot. Because it doesn't matter how much of this stuff I have, if I'm not courageous or patient enough to actually apply the good that I know in my mind to my life. If I can be scared away from the good, then I can be frightened away from union with God. Fortitude is a habit. So the first time someone is courageous, it must probably be in a small thing. People don't suddenly launch into absolute random acts of courage. There is something building up there. Right? By the way, courage and patience are two of the parts of fortitude. Courage is the active part, where one wants to go out and do something even though it's difficult. Patience is the passive part, where one continues to do something good even though difficulty is bombarding one from the outside. Now, fortitude, of course, applies most obviously in martyrdom, giving one's life for the faith. But as I said, atheists can be virtuous too, especially in these, well, only in these 4 cardinal virtues. So, of course, atheists can be brave. Atheists can be patient. Those of other religions too. But it matters why one is patient or why one is courageous also. Are we being courageous because we want to defend an innocent person? Are we being courageous because we want to speak our ideas in public and stay by our convictions? Or are we being courageous because we love our Lord above all things, and if we must die for his name, then we will? The latter is fortitude elevated and aimed through right reason towards God himself. And that happens through charity, which we'll talk about in just a moment. What we have here are the 4 cardinal virtues, able to be had by anyone in some amount, but perfected, directed towards their right end by the 3 theological virtues, which we'll turn to now. The 3 theological virtues are called theological because rather than right reason as their object is God. And rather than being attainable by human effort alone, they are attainable only by human cooperation with the grace of God. So if you'd like to get more virtuous, if you'd like to increase in faith, hope, or charity, then it's not enough just to make the effort on your own. We will need to pray, and God will need to give us grace. And of course, he gives that to different people in different ways and amounts. So we'll begin with faith. Of course, these are named first by St. Paul himself, but Thomas Aquinas sharpens them up a little bit for us and defines them for us. So faith is intellectual assent. Intellectual assent to things revealed by God. Sorry, my handwriting is getting a little sloppy there towards the end, but I'm just also saying what I'm writing. So faith is an intellectual assent to the things revealed by God. Now, before any of you get afraid or ready to throw something at me because it's intellectual assent, and that not only looks but also sounds very sort of like in the head. Faith is not in the head only for St. Thomas Aquinas. Adding the word only there is a mistake. Faith is not just what you think about, but you cannot love, you cannot act in love towards what you don't know. You cannot rightly aim your activities, what good you're trying to do in the world, without first knowing what you're doing. Otherwise, you're acting completely blindly. So calling it intellectual assent is not supposed to mean only theology nerds can be faithful. In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? Faith is simply belief in what God has revealed about himself and about the world that he has created. And it's in that order, by the way. Faith is not also a virtue contrary to reason. It doesn't mean that you turn your intellect off and just believe whatever God tells you or whatever the Bible says or whatever the church says about anything without ever asking any questions or without using your mind. No, faith is an intellectual virtue. That is to say, it is a strength that is found in our intellect. Faith, though, is only as blind and foolish or good and admirable as the one in whom you put your faith. For example, my children have no idea how seatbelts really work. They really don't. But every time they get into the car, I tell them, put on your seatbelt. We must put on your seatbelt. Do I need to explain it to them in every detail? I can't. They wouldn't understand it. And by the way, it's good for them simply to take my word for something like that. Why is that? Because I'm their father and I love them. And it builds a relationship of love between us if I don't have to explain myself on every little thing. Any parent, my own included, who has ever had to explain every single little detail of what they were thinking to an argumentative child knows that that detracts from the value of the loving relationship between the two of us. Faith is necessary for knowledge. You won't live long enough, and no matter how smart you are, you could be 150 IQ, you won't figure out everything necessary. You won't be able to personally verify everything necessary to live your life. Certainly not to live your life well. I mean, you're going to get up in the morning and pour your cornflakes into the bowl, and then you look at the thing, it's the box says cornflakes, and you go, yeah, right, we'll see about that. And you take each cornflake, put it under a microscope, but then you've got to go, oh, microscope, yeah, right, we'll make sure this works. And you're going to run your own experiments to make sure that microscopes work. You're going to personally verify everything? No way. We believe things all the time. As St. John Paul II said in Fides et Ratio, man is one who believes. Why did God make mankind to be this way? Why did he make his children in such a state that they have to just trust him and believe him on certain things? And that they have to trust and believe each other? Well, St. Thomas tells us it's because it increases fraternity. If we all had exactly the same abilities, all the same intellectual skills, all the same knowledge, and we could just verify everything personally and perfectly ourselves, we wouldn't need anybody else. It's the difference between having fellowship with someone and sharing and living in complete isolation. So the answer must be to the question, why did God make us this way? It must be because he didn't want us to live in isolation. And one can tell, anyone who's a parent can tell, that intellectual assent from the child to what the parent teaches is an incredibly beautiful and powerful part of the love between the father and the son, or the mother and the son, or whatever the case might be. So faith drives us to assent. It's the habitual assent to things that are revealed by God, first about himself and then about the world that he has made and his relationship to humanity. So it is not blind, but it is a habit. So we should think together about what that might mean, to be in the habit of trusting God. It's something that I personally wish I was a lot better at. There are people who are incredibly gifted in this virtue, who naturally have this gift. I hope I have a little more of some other ones, because this is a little bit difficult for someone who's a bit on the cynical, a bit on the skeptical side. But we should develop the habit of simply believing God, of simply trusting in the teachings of the church. Not again blindly, and we'll receive any question or criticism with open arms. But at the end of the day, we can't be lying down in our beds and going, gee, I hope this whole thing's true and not everything's a lie and my whole life is not just a fraud. You could have moments like that, but you can't do that every single day. The opposites of faith, by the way. Here are some opposites. They're not, all the virtues don't have perfect opposites, but here are some things that oppose faith. Apostasy, blasphemy, heresy, those kinds of things distort what is given to us by God through Jesus Christ, rather than believing in what God has revealed to us. So that's faith. It's an awful lot on faith, but it is, of course, very important. Hope corresponds to faith, whereas faith is intellectual assent. Faith is an intellectual virtue. Hope is a moral virtue. Hope is a movement of the will. To desire and even to expect, St. Thomas says, union with God. To desire and expect union with God. Hope has an opposite, and it's perhaps best recognized by the opposite, despair. Despair is the opposite of hope. Despair is a sin. Yes, that's right. St. Thomas Aquinas notes that despair is a sin. Now, what he's saying is not that it's a sin to be really sad. What he's saying is it's a sin to utterly despair, to utterly lose hope that God exists, that God loves you, that God can forgive your sin. Now, again, remember what sin is. Sin is not a long list of rules where God's up there with a hammer ready to zap you. If you ever, I don't know how you zap things with a hammer, but you get the point. Or God's ready to just whack you every time you do something wrong. Or like he's Santa Claus up there writing, oh, I see that you were a little bit despairing today. No, sin is that which moves us away from our final end. So therefore, you shouldn't even really need me to tell you. You don't need St. Thomas to say, hey, despair is a sin. Or despair is bad for you. Just look at someone who's lost in despair. Are they prospering? Are they becoming perfected? Are they drawing towards something that embodies everything that they were made to do? No, they're not. They're often falling. They're often spiraling into deeper and deeper despair until they decide or something moves them to break the habit. Hope is the opposite of that. So if we can easily talk about despair, we can so easily recognize profound sadness in the world around us. We constantly hear that diagnoses for depression and anxiety are skyrocketing year over year. We get more and more prescriptions written for that sort of thing. It's easy to recognize that, but don't get lost in that. I think we should remember that hope is the positive vision of expecting and wanting union with God. Not expecting like oh yeah, I'm so good. I'm definitely going to make it to heaven. No, but expecting as in the verb in Latin expecto, expectare, like to wait for. But to wait for with a hope, with a positive energy, if you want to say it like that. It's not a very good expression, but you get the point, right? If, for example, if I told my children, I won't see you today, but tomorrow I'll be home and then we can play, something like that. Imagine I walked in the door and I open it to find them sitting in the middle of the living room floor, just sort of looking dejected. And they, I come home and they go, oh, so you did come home, great. And they come and they greet me that way. They have cheapened my promise to them. They have, in fact, harmed themselves, haven't they? They've been the ones sitting there enduring sadness and being lost. So this is a really great reminder to us of the strength that is necessary for hope. I'm going to just read you. This, by the way, is the Summa of the Summa by Dr. Peter Kreeft. It is a shortened version of St. Thomas Aquinas' greatest work, the Summa Theologiae. I highly recommend it because Dr. Kreeft even puts footnotes at the bottom which explain what is going on in the Summa, because reading St. Thomas can be quite challenging. So I think this is great. If I could just find this in here. I have a quotation about hope I wanted to share. Let's see. Where did it go? I might have to edit this part out, Katie. Okay. It is nowhere. There we go. Okay. Hope, St. Thomas writes, presupposes faith, because without faith in divine revelation, there would be no ground for hoping in eternal life. Hope presupposes faith, because without faith in divine revelation, there would be no ground of hoping in eternal life. Hope presupposes faith. So again, there is a primacy in St. Thomas of knowing the truth, because you can't love the truth, you can't become excited about the truth before you know what you're thinking about. So but don't pit them against each other. That's an existentialist thing, to pit the heart against the head. We don't need to make that mistake. Anyway, finally is charity. In Latin, caritas. Charity is the love of God and all things because of him. Charity is such a stronger word than love. The English word love has been through a lot over the years, and it's hard to correct the misconceptions romanticism has done to love, has produced. But charity is a great word. It comes from the Latin caritas, and it means a willing of the good, a wishing well, an appreciation for the other. That first has to apply to God, because if I'm going to love the things of the Creator, I must love the Creator first. I shouldn't mistake His gifts for His greatness. So I can't love creation rightly until I love the Creator. So my love for God, my wanting good, my pursuit of Him, my wanting union with Him, St. Thomas writes that will end in delectio. It will end in delight and love and joy when I one day meet my Creator. Now, of course, that is not, again, none of these are through my own efforts. They're through the grace of God. They're poured out through the grace of God. And the grace of God is not magic. Just so you know, grace is defined as unearned favor in St. Thomas. So grace is not a magical thing that God can sprinkle on you. It's His favor. And that favor might come to us in some pretty different ways. It might be something beautiful and heartwarming that would fit right into a movie. You know, I might get grace, I might grow in charity when I have my first child. You know, my heart might expand greatly. Or I might grow in charity through arguing with my wife. Now, hopefully I don't argue with her that often, and hopefully I argue with her much less often than we enjoy our life together. But even in difficult moments, my point is that in difficult moments, grace comes to us also. And that perhaps can be the most charity-building event in our lives is when we endure the cross. Because after all, the ultimate symbol of love for the other is the cross. No man has greater love than this, that He laid down His life for His friends, of course, in the words of Jesus. I'll read you another thing here from St. Thomas on charity. This is brilliant. Charity is the friendship of man for God, founded on the fellowship of everlasting happiness. All of these, by the way, come from the Summa Theologiae, which is the work of St. Thomas. Charity is the friendship of man for God, the friendship of man for God. So in approaching our final end, we're going to need the queen of all the virtues, charity, because charity is the love that directs all the other six towards their proper object, which is God, and then, after Him, all of creation. In all of these, we are journeying towards God. We are approaching union with God, which won't happen here on earth, but will happen in heaven. Now, there's plenty of sin along the way. There's plenty of distractions along the way. We mess up all the time. So it's not to say that if you've got a good streak going of fortitude and you suddenly act like a coward one day, or you're suddenly weak and lazy one day, it doesn't mean you've broken your streak and now you've got to start all over. And we shouldn't view it like that. We are just inertial creatures, though, when it comes to the habits that we form. The more we can do the good, the more we can draw closer to God, not only by our own effort, but by cooperation with Him. And so ultimately, charity directs all the virtues back to Him and produces as its outcome things like joy and benevolence and mercy and beautiful appreciation for the other. So these are all named in the Summa Theologiae. If you're curious, I get all my references from the Summa. I'll attach some of them in the description of this video if you'd like to look up any of the quotes that I've got in here. And hopefully this introduces us once more to the concept that morality is not a list of commands to be followed and broken. Of course, there are commandments. Of course, we can break God's law. But it's really about who we are. Moral theology is about the character that will one day allow us to, as C.S. Lewis said, have a face when we meet our Lord Jesus in judgment. And He'll be able to say to us, come now into my rest, my son, my good and faithful servant, right? Rather than depart from me, I never knew you. So those are the virtues. Look for a video on the vices with St. Thomas Aquinas coming soon.